Welcome, everybody. My name is Adam Heinrich. Today I'm going to be talking about the archaeology at the Restore Lippincott Homestead site, located in today Burlington County, New Jersey, specifically East Hampton, Burlington County, New Jersey. So first off, thanks ASNJ for letting me do this, and the second thanks to Alexis Salemi for this beautiful title slide, which I've already yanked and put into the presentation. Very nice. Oh, okay. First things first, how do I change the slide? Okay. So the Restore Lippincott Homestead site, as you may be able to see on this map here, is located just west of today's Route 206 in East Hampton, New Jersey. You can see that the site is in close proximity to a tributary of the Rancocas Creek. It's called Powell's Run, and it's actually at the intersection of Powell's Run and another sort of unnamed tributary right there. So it would have been a nice sort of waterway and landing area for inhabitants of this site. Now, the site dates to about 1690. It was occupied into the probably late 1820s. And it gets abandoned about the late 1820s, about 1830, when the next heir to the family, he was too young. So before he reached the age of maturity, the property was under management from other family members. And then it seemed that when he came to age, he abandoned the site and instead built a house along what is today Smithville Road. So if you know historic Smithville, just outside of Mount Holly, you know the road. And that road gets laid in about 1808 or 1809, somewhere around there. So they move the focus of the occupation of this property from the waterway towards the road. Right? So you can see this project area that we surveyed. It was 122 acres, over 2,200 shovel tests were excavated across this whole area. And so we're dealing with a time period where the maps do not really tell us much about what's happening on the site. So you can see the approximate project location, sort of due east of Mount Holly a bit. You do see the Lippincotts having a presence in the 18th century. There's a little crossroads with a small town they were calling Lippinwatts or Lippincotts at the time. It must be a mistranslation because I think this was a German map made during the Revolution. And then the first mapped buildings that we see on the property appear in 1849. So again, I said about 1830, the heir of the family, William G. Lippincott, abandons the property or abandons the site, moves towards the roadway, builds a house there. And from about the 1830s up until about the 1940s, that house stood before it was demolished for agricultural experimentation center, so pesticide, stuff like that. And most recently, it was a mechanic shop. But he also ended up building a second house in the northwest corner of this lot in the late 19th century, about the 1890s. And that second house seems to have been a house for either extended family or farm laborers that he hired. Right. And so when we did our shovel test survey, you can see the tiny little dots, which probably don't show up very well on anyone's screen, but you can see the arrangement of these sites. So the Restore Lippincott Homestead site in the sort of the lower right corner measured close to about 9 acres in size. And then you can see the William G. Lippincott House 1, which was about the approximately 1830s house, right along the road there. And then in the northwest corner, you have his second house, which you got late 19th century up until more recently. Now, we only pursued additional archaeological excavation at the Restore Lippincott Homestead site. The other ones were pretty well damaged or disturbed by more recent developments. This place was also a sod farm, so the upper house was pretty much wiped away by that. But the documentary record that we have for the Restore Lippincott Homestead site is hit and miss, depending on the type of information you may want. Restore Lippincott himself was a very affluent Quaker man. He was born in England to a father who seems to have gotten in a little bit of trouble, as I think many Quakers did in the mid-17th century, sort of when Quakerism was really sort of becoming developed. And so you may notice that Restore has a bit of an unusual name. And it matches pretty well with some of his brothers who were named Freedom Lippincott and Remembrance Lippincott. And there was another brother named John. So the names seem to represent moments in their father's life. So with his father getting in trouble, going to prison, the names represent these different milestones. So Restore sort of, I think, represents his freedom out of prison. He's restoring his his honor or whatever it is. And so anyway, they move over. They're originally in Rhode Island, and they're only there for a little while. They're not getting along very well with the Puritans because they're Quakers. And they eventually moved on to Shrewsbury. And so Restore's younger life includes a little bit of England, Rhode Island, and then Shrewsbury. But when he comes of age, starts developing a family, he's still in Shrewsbury. And then eventually he moves out to, at that time, what was called Northampton, West Jersey. Eventually becomes East Hampton, Burlington County. And so we know that he's a relatively affluent man. He starts off as a husbandman, and he eventually attains the title of yeoman, which means he's a sort of the owner of a free, relatively modest estate. He's an elder in the church, which is a pretty prestigious position in the Quaker faith. And he was also a multiple elected West Jersey assemblyman. So he had some power and influence in West Jersey in the late 17th into the early, late 17th into the early 18th century. But the documentary record in terms of what's happening on the farmstead is a little more sparse. We don't really get much. We know that he officially buys the property in 1692 from Thomas Olive. That 1692 deed references a plantation on which Restore currently resides. So he's already living there by 1692. And if we follow the birth of his children, he actually had 6 daughters and 3 sons. And we see going up into the late 1680s, his children are still born in Shrewsbury, but by the time he's getting into the 1690s, his kids are born in Northampton. So it seems that he's on the property by about 1690. And this is I'm going to talk forever if I go too much into this, but this is a period of time when there's a lot of uncertainty over who owns the land. The proprietors were selling land or sort of leasing land to people who thought they were actually buying it. And so there's moments where land was being taken back, claiming that it was only being rented, even though the occupant thought they had bought it. And so this seems to be one of those moments where he was on land that was probably in dispute. And then by 1692, though, it's officially settled. He owns the land and what forth. And so the documentary record after that, though, is sparse until we get to his will. 1733-4, he writes his will. He ends up passing away in 1741. But the 2 things I want to highlight in his will, and you see highlighted in blue, it is also my will that my wife shall have the use of 2 rooms below the stairs at the west side of my now dwelling house, with a garden adjoining thereto, with privilege of going through the kitchen to fetch water from the well. And so a couple things. It gives us a little bit of architectural information. We start seeing a layout of the house. I also like the use of the word now dwelling house, suggesting possibly that there are 2 dwellings on this property at some point, maybe an earlier one and a later one, which seems to be shown in the archaeological record. And then the second important thing on this slide is in white. So it says, unto my son James Lippincott, which was his second eldest son, 10 pounds in my 2 old Negroes with their bedding and clothes. And so the Restore Lippincott homestead site is important for New Jersey history for a couple of different reasons. First, it goes back to the 17th century. And 17th century archaeological sites in New Jersey are really rare. Due to partly sparse populations, but also a lot of these settlements were in areas that are developed, Elizabeth, Newark, Camden, et cetera. It's also important because we don't have a lot of evidence for slavery in New Jersey because you think about the proportions of people who own slaves and the numbers of slaves owned by these people was generally in smaller amounts compared to like the big plantation societies you have towards the mid-Atlantic and South. And so you would have a small number of slaves who generally lived in closer proximity to their owners. And this meant that the archaeological residues of the peoples, both the master class and the subordinate class, would be sort of mixed up or overlapping each other, and you can't really tell them apart too easily. And so this site is really important because it does allow us to see some of this distinction. And another reason it's important is when we think of Quakers, they often benefit from the reputation of being early abolitionists, right? They get a lot of credit for freeing slaves early on. But we do have to acknowledge the fact that Quakers did own slaves. And in fact, many of them owned slaves past the point which many of them were emancipated. We had we have slave-owning Quakers going into the early 19th century. And so in addition to the obviously black slaves, the African descent slaves, we understand that the Lippincotts were also enslaving and indenturing and probably other ways of acquiring labor from Native Americans. Now, in 1721, we have this will and eventually the probate inventory of a man named Samuel Lippincott. Samuel Lippincott is Restore's eldest son. In 1699, he is given about half of Restore's property, and he sets up his own household just on the other side of Powell's Run. I'm imagining they could probably see each other's houses. They were so close to each other. And if you see in his will in 1721, his personal property includes 2 Indians. And then when he dies only a few months later, you see his personal estate still includes those 2 Indians worth 75 pounds. And a little more detail in his will, you see when his son Job turned 21 years of age in 1729, he was scheduled to inherit Samuel's farm in Springfield, as well as the Indian man named Will. And then his other son, Samuel Lippincott Jr., was scheduled to inherit the Northampton farm, which would have been the one Samuel Sr. got from his father Restore. And the Indian boy named Tom upon reaching maturity in 1731. And so this is important. You know, we see the enslavement of Native American people, which is not something well known about our colonial history, especially in the New Jersey and Mid-Atlantic area. We see Native American enslavement a little more, it's a little more well known towards the southeast, like the Carolina areas. And again, but these are specifically dealing with Samuel Lippincott's property, again, the estate just across the Powell's Run from Restore. But when we look at this other newspaper extract, we have a runaway ad by Jacob Lippincott, who was Restore's 3rd eldest son. He's the one who actually inherits the Restore Lippincott homestead site property. And there we have a man named William Bush, aged about 18 or 19 years of age, with particular hair and everything else, but you see that he's described as having a whitish complexion. And the fact that they're describing him as having a whitish complexion suggests that perhaps he's not actually white. He's not white in the European perspective, but maybe he's a Native American or other sort of, at that time they would call like mulattoes or whatever, mixed biracial people. And his complexion would therefore almost be passable as white. This is one of those things where the terms are quite vague when you look at these records. They talk about different ways of describing skin tint and colors and things like that. But very often when you see someone of European descent, they describe like a Palatine man or an Irish woman or something like that. So the fact that they're calling this person or having this, they're saying that this person's having a whitish complexion suggests maybe that there's he's not white in the European perspective. And the thing about William Bush, though, is that we don't have any other record of him at the property. He doesn't show up in the will. He's not in the probate, which could mean that his time on the property was relatively short. It could mean that his runaway was quite successful. It's important to realize that William Bush here running away in 1736 is not the same the Indian man named Will that Samuel's son Job was going to inherit. You see, in 1729, the Indian man named Will was already being described as a man. William Bush in 1736 is only 18 to 19 years of age. So 1729, he would have been, I would assume, a child. I don't think they would be calling a child or a young adolescent a man at that time. I don't really know. Might require a little more language. But either way, it's likely that the Lippincotts on the Restore Lippincott homestead site would have used enslaved Native American labor, or at least indentured or other type of maybe hired Native American labor. And the fact that the 2 households right across from each other had only 2 slaves, as well as children and whatever else, it's likely that the slave and other labor were being shared across the properties when it came time to do important large-scale tasks, perhaps like maybe construction activities, harvesting, land clearing, planting, things like that. So it's very likely that Restore's slaves would have gone to other properties, and Samuel's slaves could have come over to Restore's. And so the archaeology, we identified 2 buildings. The one on the left is what we call a feature 2, initially interpreted as the main house because of its large, substantial sandstone foundation. We only hit the corner of it during the phase 2 survey. The 2 pictures on the right are from the feature we called feature 1, simply just because it was found first. It had a modestly deep cellar. but we didn't find any architectural remains except this line of small cobbles, which we thought might have been indicative of a less substantial building. So we called that, or we initially interpreted that as a possible out kitchen. So when it came time for the phase 3 survey, we had recognized a sort of a peripheral site area where artifact densities were low, probably maybe places where barns were, animal pens, things like that. And then we had a site core where we knew the buildings were and more dense artifact deposits. So we had a backhoe come in, we stripped a large area, uncovering features. And as you can see here, this is a well that was being uncovered. This ends up being feature 2 when we uncovered it. So initially interpreted as the main house because of its large, intact sandstone foundation, it ended up being quite small. It kind of made me question a little bit. It ended up being about 13 to 14 feet wide, 16 and a half, 17 feet long. Feature 1, on the other hand, ended up being massive. It was about 17 feet wide, 41 feet long, and it had this additional L that was about 14 feet long, 10 feet wide off its northern end. The subsoil around here varied from a greenish glauconitic type of soil to a very yellowy type soil, so this feature doesn't show up too well. We also had major water issues, so if you can see some of the trenches in the background, they are currently full to the top with rainwater. So it made things a little difficult to maintain here. But anyway, here's a plan view of the homestead when we fully cleaned it off. You can see feature 2 up here, this smaller building with the intact foundation. You can see its orientation with feature 1, and then we have 2 wells. Now, looking at the archaeological record, the artifacts that we were finding within it, and the written record, we were ultimately able to determine that feature 2 was probably actually the first dwelling on the site. Remember, at this time period, the property ownership was sort of a little uncertain. Again, proprietors and renters were going back and forth about who actually owned the land. So you can imagine a family coming into Northampton, trying to establish something. They would probably build something relatively, quick, maybe smaller, just to sort of establish that foothold, and then while they're there, expand. And so feature 2 is interpreted as the original dwelling, the first dwelling, starting in about 1690. And it seems to have been burned in about 1720, in the 1720s. The main house, or the second dwelling, seems to have been built by 1700. Again, this is partly due to archaeological evidence. We did have a dated window lead in this building dating to 1679, and while the building may not be built exactly when the window lead is made, they're usually made within some reasonable amount of time. So we're probably seeing this building built by about 1700, and it gets used up until about 1830. And so you can see the orientation of the wells. Feature 3 is the first well, again dating to about 1690 up until about the 1820s. And then we see that well being abandoned, and a second well, feature 26, being dug in 1820s. And we actually have a receipt where one of the extended family members of the Lippincotts gets paid $11 to dig a well in the early 1820s. And that well only gets used a little while until the site's abandoned in about 1830. But you also notice that there's a mess of post holes, but the features to the north and to the west of these homes are kind of interesting because they likely represent the garden area. You remember the Restore's will talks about his wife being able to use certain rooms in this second building, the second dwelling, while able to go to the well, which would have been feature 3 at the time, and she's allowed to go to the garden attached to the house, right? So up to the north and west of the house, attached, right outside her rooms. All right. So the Archaeology of Feature 2 was incredibly revealing. It had a lot of really important information about early settlement in sort of West Jersey. And so here you can see the evidence of the burning. We see 2 partially preserved floor joists that would have held the floor. Important to note as well, not super crisp, but in the northern western corner, you'll see this darker soil with a cubic looking artifact sticking out of it. That is a subfloor pit that was dug through some occupational layers. Here's the quadrant just to the north of the last one shown, and you can see the subfloor pit a little clearer. Now it's not quite deep. It's not quite a deep pit, but this subfloor pit was actually dug through an occupational fill. So the property, the dwelling was occupied, which again we're interpreting as having been occupied by the Lippincott family, and probably also their enslaved laborers at the time. And then when they build that second house, the family's growing. Like I said, they had 6 daughters and 3 sons. When the second house gets built, the original dwelling, which was this relatively small, modest building, was likely converted to be an out kitchen. And while it was serving as an out kitchen, it would have also served as the quarters for the enslaved laborers. And so here, half of the feature excavated. You can see the profile with the subfloor pit in the middle. And then here's the western half. You can see, again, a stain from the floor joist, that linear brown mark toward the bottom of the picture. And you can see the fill of this subfloor pit just to the north of it. Right. And so in profile, you can see how fill 6, which is the subfloor pit, is cut through fill 5. So fill 5 is the soil that seems to have accumulated during the occupation of the dwelling prior to it probably becoming this out kitchen and quarters. And then once the Lippincotts are out of the building, they're living now in the second dwelling. The enslaved laborers have a little more freedom in terms of how they want to use the building, so they can then dig their subfloor pit and use it as whatever purpose they have. And we have some hints as to what the subfloor pit was used for. Here's it fully excavated. Again, remember that pit would have been a little deeper because it would have cut through one of the occupational fills. And here's the drawing. And what's key to seeing this this subfloor pit, you see that we have the remains of those beams, right? Those floor joists. And just to the sort of northern end of this pit, you see a couple stones. One's sticking out of the foundation like a little shelf. The other one's sort of right at the edge of this pit. It looks like there was probably another joist up there. And so the subfloor pit would have fit between, maybe undercutting a little bit, but sort of fit between these two east to west floor joists, while then fully undercutting, though, the north-south floor joist. Right. Now moving over to feature 1. Now this is, if you got to sort of attach these two together to see the full profile of this thing. Remember, it's a 41-foot long building. And it revealed a lot of interesting information about the architecture of this time period. From the will and the probate record, which sort of agreed in terms of the numbers of rooms and how they were laid out, this was likely an original hall and parlor type building. We had 2 rooms to the what do you call it, the left side of the building, 1 room, which would have been the hall on the right side of the building. And so from this, it looks like the parlor side of the building, where Restore's widow would have been able to live, would have had maybe a crawl space beneath it. And then the hall part of the building would have had a fuller cellar. And again, these are relatively shallow, but you got to remember we had a plow zone on top of this. This place was also a sod farm, so small layers of soil probably got removed over time, and so it truncated all this a little bit. But it seems that this building expands further through time, and so at the time of Restore's will, 1741, it's still this hall and parlor type building, right? So we have room on the left, room on the right, and that's it. It had a second story as well. It does talk about rooms above stairs. But after 1741, it seems that there's another 10-foot addition added to the east side of the building. And so if you look at about the 30 to 32, 33-foot mark, there's a bump of the subsoil, which likely indicated where maybe another structural support stood, maybe one of the original sort of eastern wall supports for the hall and parlor building. And then they extend the building another 10 feet. So if you see out by about the 40-foot mark, there's some more sandstone indicating the location of where that foundation would have been. Now the feature does continue beyond this. You'll see fill 5s and 17s going way beyond this 40-foot mark. And like we had trouble with the weather because of drainage issues and stuff like that. It's likely they had drainage issues as well. And this additional extension of the feature was a way to drain the cellar, keep it somewhat dry. I'm just gonna keep going. All right, so just to give you a little chronology of the buildings here. So again, 1690 to approximately 1700, it's likely they had that 1-room dwelling. It may have been a story or a story and a half, maybe 2 stories tall, but it was largely 1 room. And if you sort of center the walls over the foundations, it would have been a 10-foot by 15-foot living space. So again, quite cramped for a married couple with numerous children and enslaved laborers. Then by about 1700, we see this second building being constructed. So again, the parlor with a back room, like storage area, maybe a workspace, which is where Restore's widow would eventually sort of reside until the end of her life. And then you have a hall. So the parlor was about 10 feet wide. The hall was about 20 feet wide, which basically means that the new hall and parlor structure was being built as units of the original building. So the original dwelling was 10 by 15. The new building would have also been 10 by 15 or 20 by 15. All right. And so by about 1720s, it seems that the out kitchen / enslaved laborer quarters is gone. It seems to have been burned by that point. And that means that probably all those people, the slaves are still on property until at least 1741 when they get willed to the child. And so they're probably all now in this house. So we have the hall and parlor, the hall probably having to take on some role as a kitchen at this time. And you can see the blue arrow is indicating the route in which Restore's widow would have been allowed to go, right? So she has access to her well, and she has access and the privilege of going to her garden right outside her house there. And again, so sometimes after 1741, they're building another 10-foot section to the east side of the building. We don't know what that room would have been used for. It could have been another chamber. It could have been a dining room. And then by the late 18th century, extending until about 1830, they add this kitchen L, which likely indicates in that third chamber that was done previously, it might have been a dining room because of its proximity to that kitchen. And so that's ultimately what the house finally looked like before the site gets abandoned. The house gets demolished, and a lot of the material gets cannibalized. They're probably using it to build the next house about 1830 up along the road because there's not a lot of the foundation left. Okay. And something I'm not going to get into, but one of the interesting things about this property is that they do have a garden, and with a couple fence lines we see extending from the northern side and also the western side of the building, and these larger pits, these relatively roundish to amorphous pits, creating this nice right angle. Those are likely a tree line, maybe suggesting sort of a boundary of where this garden was. And gardens are something interesting in historical archaeology because a lot of attention gets paid to these gardens in the later 18th century because people are looking at Palladian architecture. They're looking at gardens as symbols of status. They're looking at the symmetry and these forced perspectives, which sort of are ways in which these wealthy people can show off their status. But what Restore and his family have is probably more of a medieval style garden. And looking at other examples from the 17th century, like up in Massachusetts, going back to England, some of these gardens are often in the backyard, so they're not as conspicuous. They're not going to be visible to people coming up roads or up the waterways right away. But they still would have had a lot of similar purpose, right? They would have still been a way to display exotic plants. They would have been ways to sort of experiment with cultivation and domestication. They would have largely also been a retreat and been used for health purposes and just status in general. So going back to feature 2, so this talk is going to largely focus on the enslaved laborer aspect of the site because again the other stuff will just go on forever. But through the excavation of this, with the recognition of the subfloor pit and some very sort of unusual artifacts, we started to recognize the presence of the enslaved laborers. And so I showed you this sort of cubic piece of quartz that was sort of sticking out of the corner of the subfloor pit. Just a little bit south of that, sort of between where these burned floor joists were, we had another cache. We had a pewter spoon. Right next to that was an iron canister. And so the top picture here with the north arrow, you can see those two things side by side. Near that was also a pile of copper pins. So, it's hard to say too much about them, except they were present, they were all close together, and they likely were probably, put there on purpose, whatever else. But one of the most remarkable artifacts found by our president of the ASNJ, Mike Gall, when he came out to help one day, was this thing we call a bone needle case. So it's made of bone, it's shaped, and it's highly decorated. And it was kind of like a holy cow moment when I recognized a similar object on the cover of Subfloor Pits in the Archaeology of Slavery in Colonial Virginia by Patricia Sanford. Now, the example on the book cover dates from about 1700 to 1730s at a plantation called Utopia in Virginia. And the design on there is described as the Eye of God motif. And so what's important about this symbol is that there's an emphasis on the number 4. So you got these diamond shapes, you got the 4 sort of semi-lunar shapes or repeating patterns across this object. The bone needle case from the Restore Lippincott house site also emphasizes the number 4. So if you look at all these sort of diagonal lines, they are repetitive 4s across the entire thing. Now, we recognize that a lot of the enslaved laborers in the American colonies were coming out of West Africa. And so we often look to West Africa for sort of Africanisms, things that we see in Africa that we could also see in the American colonies. And the number 4 is one of these things that we see very common, particularly in the Kwa language cultural groups. And the Kwa language cultural groups are prominent in the Nigeria to Congo area, maybe extending a little more to the Ivory Coast, Senegal area. And so we have cultural groups like the Congolese, the Igbo, and others, Yoruba, in that area. And these people were heavily exploited during the slave period. Now, in there, the number 4 was considered a lucky number in divination. So in West Africa, the kola nut is an important product, and if you break open the kola nut and there are 4 chambers inside, then it's considered lucky. If you've got 2 chambers, you're considered to have conjured or interacted with a dumb spirit. There's a divination called Afa, where they use 4 strings with 4 mango or bush nuts tied to each one, and then they would sort of throw these strings and see which way the nuts lay. And so the number 4 is a common motif that we see repeated over and over and over again in West Africa. And so the fact that we're seeing the number 4 represented on this needle case likely represents that this object was used by and probably decorated by someone of West African origin, or at least West African descent. Right. And so I showed you the picture of it sort of in situ, this quartz block. It's a modified quartz block. It's been shaped roughly into a relatively rectangular form. So it's got a couple natural surfaces, but it's also got these sort of broken off surfaces. And quartz crystals are quite common on African-American sites or enslaved African sites throughout the Mid-Atlantic area, particularly Maryland and Virginia, where a lot of this archaeology has been done. And the use of these quartz crystals, again, they're found in relatively low numbers, like an individual piece or maybe a small number of pieces, but they're often considered to represent an element of the divination magic. The sort of murky but shimmery surface may represent water barriers, which is, again, another important aspect of West African faith. And then we did have some other objects as well. And so I'm showing them all here together with the map to show how they're oriented around this subfloor pit. So we had the quartz block in the lower right corner. That bone needle case was in the lower left corner, along with some quartz pebbles. And I'm kicking myself a bit too, because I think that lower left corner also included some clamshells. And or at least I didn't make the recognition that those could be all associated together at the time. But anyway, we at least had some quartz pebbles and that bone needle case in close proximity in that lower left corner. In the upper left corner, we had a copper spoon, as you can see there. It was complete until a clumsy person broke it. But we don't have anything in the upper right corner. And the lack of something in the upper right corner makes it just a little bit more challenging to argue that this is all related to spiritual practices. But other historians and archaeologists like Mark Leone and Chris Fennell, they note that a lot of West African divination magic included organic materials, so roots, bark, hair, and other things, wood, and things like that would have been super important. So the fact that we don't have anything up in that upper corner could indicate something of a more organic nature that just didn't preserve. But anyway, when we're looking at these other objects, the fact that they're at the corners, they're not north, south, east, west, but they're sort of in the direction of the corners of the building. And if they're all different materials, so we have the quartz block, we have the bone needle case, which likely has needles within it because of the sort of, we can't get into it. It's all sort of oxidized, irony appearance inside. So there's likely the iron needles inside. You have the copper in the upper corner. So having these materials, which have sort of acknowledged spiritual purposes and oriented in a sort of at the corners of this feature, suggests that this pit could have served partly as a function, or could have partly served as a function as a shrine, which again, something we see very often in enslaved quarter sites throughout the Virginia, Maryland areas, where you see similar kinds of objects plus crossed axes and animal bones like raccoon mandibles and other things like that. Another object that we had from Feature 2 was a tobacco pipe stem with an incised X on it. Now, when you see incised X's on enslaved African sites, you get a little, little flags go up, because the X markings is something that people make a big deal about on colonaware, sort of an African described ceramic type. And the X marks are often interpreted to be Bakongo spirituality. And so that little diagram in the bottom corner is sort of indicating that. So you have the X indicating these sort of crossroads where you have a water boundary and a pathway from the dead world to the living world, and so forth. So again, the number 4 is emphasized here, right? You have quadrants, you have directions, and things like that. Some people argue that the 4 quadrants could represent the 4 matrilineal descents of a person of West African descent. So there's a lot of emphasis on that number 4 again. But the fact that we have this X on a tobacco pipe stem may be significant. And it is in Feature 2, again, where we likely had the enslaved African occupants. And the fact that it's on a tobacco pipe stem may be additionally important because, first off, the color white is often attributed to the sort of the attention towards the spiritual world, death, things like that. So we see the color white often in other sort of aspects of West African spirituality, as well as tobacco. Tobacco was commonly smoked by both Native Americans and Africans and others, where the smoke would bring offering, bring message, it could bring prayer, or whatever it is, upwards to spirits that humans themselves cannot reach physically. And one of the most remarkable objects that we had was part of a tobacco pipe bowl made out of a red clay with punctated designs and white infill. And now these pipes are generally associated with the Chesapeake. In fact, they're very rare any further north. In fact, I think this is the only example from North America, it's the only example known from New Jersey, at least to you. I asked the ASNJ listserv and I got a couple Native American examples, but these pipe stems that are more associated with African Americans have not been found in New Jersey. Now, the book by Anna Agby Davies there, she goes into detail what these pipes could mean and who was making them. And there's a whole lot of variables, which again, I'm not going to get into because I'm probably already talking too much. And I can't see a clock where I am, so I apologize how long I'm going. But these are often made on plantations. They seem to have been made either by enslaved or indentured laborers. They share styles from both European-made pipes as well as sort of more indigenous, whether Native American or African style pipes. And so it's likely being made by either indentured white laborers or maybe possibly African American or Native American laborers on these plantations. But what's important is that these pipes do leave the plantations, even if the people themselves may not leave. And after Bacon's Rebellion in the later 17th century, there's a clampdown on the amount of movement that enslaved people or even maybe indentured people can have. But we do see these pipes moving beyond the plantations through trade or whatever other process. But the fact that this shows up in New Jersey it raises a good question, or an important question. And it's like, well, how did it get there? And so is it the movement of Chesapeake material culture up to New Jersey? Or could it represent the movement of human property from the Chesapeake up to New Jersey? And it is very likely that a lot of the enslaved Native Americans and also the enslaved Africans in New Jersey were coming out of the Chesapeake area. And New Jersey ends up passing a lot of laws throughout, well, not a lot, but several laws throughout the 18th century, putting duties on the importation of slaves into the colony. Oops. So moving to the Native Americans real quick. Like I said, we know that Samuel Lippincott, the eldest son of Restore, across the little stream, owned Native American slaves. And when we started to excavate the Restore Lippincott homestead site, we were aware of the potential sensitivity, the likeliness of finding Native American artifacts on the property because we were close to the water. But through our huge survey of over 2,000 something shovel tests, we only found 16 Native American artifacts, very sort of widely scattered across this 122-acre site. But instead, when we started to get into these features, we started finding a greater proportion of Native American artifacts, including this nutting stone, which has ground and battered surfaces and ends, and it's hard to see, but there's a depression on the top surface. And you can see on the photograph of this quadrant of feature 2, the nutting stone was found within the occupational fill layer, layer 5, and it's in situ there. So it was within the occupational layers. It wasn't something that ends up being mixed up. It doesn't end up getting sort of thrown in as part of the fill to get rid of this building when it burns down. We also had a pretty good proportion of tools, right? So we had a total of 60 something Native American artifacts. I forgot the exact number off the top of my head. But of those I think it's 67. Of those 67 Native American artifacts, over 30 of those were found in feature 2, and another 25 about were found in feature 1. And then the rest sort of in nearby features to these two buildings. But the fact that a great proportion of these Native American artifacts were tools, including things like scrapers and utilized flakes, suggests that people were there using the tools and using them to process some kind of materials in a relatively traditional kind of way. Now, when we talk about slavery in New Jersey, again, it's very often focused on the enslavement of Black people. And Native American enslavement doesn't get a lot of publicity, or it doesn't get published or written about. Not a lot of research is done on it otherwise. But we do know that Native Americans were brought into New Jersey as slaves, because those duty legislations that were enacted throughout the 18th century do include references to African, or Negro they call them, mulatto and Indian slaves. And we also had a number of what we would call more formal tools, bifaces. Several of them are sort of, they lack the diagnostic qualities. They're sort of common shapes that you see throughout the Archaic and Woodland period. We had a couple triangles what's the right word? They are quite similar to what we would consider the Madison style biface, which is the type of triangular biface that we see Native Americans using through the point of contact when Europeans are starting to come up. So these are they're 17th century style of bifaces. And so the use of these traditional Native American style tools into the 18th century is not unheard of in New Jersey. We think of, again, when we think of our US history, we think of often Europeans showing up, the landscape clears of Native Americans, and then they're going off further west. But there's still a significant presence of Native Americans in these areas. The use of traditional tools does extend into the 18th century. In fact, two prominent sites in New Jersey, the Burr Haynes site, which is actually relatively close to the Restore Lippincott Homestead site, was probably a Native American occupied site, a high proportion of Native American tools with European material culture. You have the site of Bethel, which is in Middlesex County, also largely European material culture there, but there was some Native American material culture as well. So both of those sites date from the 1740s and 50s, which would post-date this feature 2, which is more of a 1690 to 1720s time period. All right, and just lastly, another thing that sort of matches, it compares to the archaeology of enslaved Native Americans or African Americans in other sites throughout the American colonies, is the emphasis of wild faunal remains. Now, we do have a little bit of issue with feature 2 because, first off, it was a dwelling with the Lippincott family, and then it functions probably as an out kitchen and a quarter at the same time. So a lot of the Lippincott food would have been processed in that building too. And so the numbers of cattle, sheep, and pig could represent the food of the Lippincotts as much as it could represent the food of the laborers too. But when we look at the other types of food, the wild animal remains are relatively diverse. So we have white-tailed deer, squirrel, mouse, which questionable whether it's food or just sort of something that lives amongst them. You have raccoon, rabbit, Atlantic sturgeons. You have other kinds of fish which were not diagnostic enough to identify to species. We had mussels, clams, oysters, turtle, and wild birds like mallard, turkey, passenger pigeon, and goose. Right? And so when we look at the whole site, the presence of wild food remains in other features, like feature 1, is not really present. There's the occasional, like another feature has a one deer bone, another feature has one rabbit bone, but otherwise the wild fauna is limited to this feature 2. So again, speaks to the fact that these people, in addition to living or carrying on more traditional ways of life, their spirituality, their tool use, and that kind of stuff, they may also be continuing the more traditional consumption of wild animal remains. And of course, when we talk about the consumption of wild animal remains with these people, there's also the possibility of trying to compensate where maybe they're not being fed well enough by their masters, the enslaving class. And so therefore they need to sort of make up their calorie deficiencies, because these people are working incredibly hard. They need a lot of calories to do the work that they're required to do. And so they try to compensate for that by eating what they're provisioned, but also adding to it some wild foods. And so those are things that we can't necessarily answer without the accounts of the laborers themselves. But the fact that we see this high proportion, high diversity of wild food remains in a site where we have this other sort of more diagnostic material culture, again, speaks to the experiences of these forced laborers on this property. Okay, that's all I have. I thank you very much. I hope I didn't go way too over time, but it is what it is, right? Thank you.